What if I told you that RuneScape almost died just a year after the game was released? If you clicked on this video, RuneScape has probably touched your life in some way. Imagine if it had entirely disappeared back in 2002. If you're not a lifelong RuneScape enthusiast like me, it might not seem like such a big deal, but if you know anything about the butterfly effect, you know that a world without RuneScape would have been different. So many connections would have never been made, so many life lessons wouldn't be learned.
Society needs a lot of younger people to get scammed in video games. And that may seem weird to say, but to be honest with you, I feel like there's a whole lot of people on the internet that have never faced any type of consequences for their actions in any possible way, and none of them have gotten an armor trimming in RuneScape, basically.
Every single one of these people shown have played RuneScape, and that's not a joke. Well, maybe except for one of them. What did they learn in their time in Gelinor? How did it affect their decisions in the real world? Did it cause this guy's team to finish in last place this season while he focused on maxing his Iron Man? Heck, RuneScape might have another cultural revolution coming soon.
This game? I heard this was like one of the craziest games ever though. Zezma?
Put old school, type in old school RuneScape. Chat, catching that on RuneScape, chat? Oh my god.
It's insane to think about the real-world impact that this silly kids game has had and will have, and how all of it almost never happened.
I can't afford to run this game, it's costing me money to run it, I'm going to have to shut it down. And I really didn't want to shut it down because I'd spent, well over a year making it by this point, poured everything into it.
As I set out to research this video, the real-world implication became more serious than I had even initially thought. There's a surprising number of children whose parents met in-game who would have never even been born without RuneScape. Yes, there are real people who met and got married in-game before meeting and getting married in real life as well. And then they had kids, some of whom are probably already adults. More internally, there are a bunch of people who make some, if not their whole living from RuneScape. Jagex employees, creators, artists, and even gold farmers. The most famous example being Venezuela's hyperinflated economy, causing their people to turn toward earning RuneScape's more stable virtual gold pieces to keep their lights on and put food on the table. RuneScape's butterfly effect has reached out infinitely in both positive and negative ways. So sit back and let me tell you all about the RuneScape update that changed the world. So what exactly was this update that forever altered the course of human history?
And my mum happened to be frying some bacon one day, and I was standing there with a voice recorder recording it, and the sound of cooking in RuneScape Classic is the sound of my mum frying some bacon.
No, not that, but if you guessed that it was an update to the RuneScape world map, you'd surprisingly be right. February 27th. 2002. The Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, Utah, in the United States, had just concluded, with Germany taking home the most total medals, Norway taking home the most gold medals, and the host country finishing in just second and third in those categories, respectively. Alicia Keys won a handful of Grammys on this date, but let's be real, no one who clicked on this video cares about that. Much more relevant to our community who grew up on RuneScape music videos, Linkin Park won a Hard Rock Grammy for Crawling, and Tool won a Metal Grammy for Schism, a couple of vintage classics, just like most of us. Far more important than these peak athletic and artistic achievements would have to be the additional time we got to spend playing video games on the family computer. While the game as it stood at the end of 2001 is essentially the free-to-play version of the game that we know today, we now also had a pay-to-play expansion to every region of the map. The update that saved RuneScape from certain extinction was none other than membership. For a fee of just $5 per month, we can now access new features, new quests, new skills, and new areas. If you had a single account with continuous membership from then until now, with the original grandfathered rate of $5 or £3.20 or €4.60 per month locked in, you would have spent approximately $1,400 or £900 or €1,300 on membership to access just one single account on just one single game, excluding FunOrb, of course. Almost every single update over the next 23 years would be locked behind this paywall, and there were really quite a lot of updates. but let's just focus on this one for now. What's interesting about those original prices is that when accounting for February 2002 exchange rates, it was actually much cheaper to buy British membership for £3.20 because British membership was effectively only the equivalent of $2.24 in the US or just €2. It's safe to assume that this was done to help Jagex pay for the currency translation fees from euros and dollars that they obviously didn't have to deal with for their own native British pounds, with them being based out of Cambridge in the UK. We also saw a further expansion of the game's first region expansion of Esgarnia. Yes, just on the other side of Falador's western wall was a region further fleshed out with such iconic locations as Taverley and its dungeon, the Heroes Guild, White Wolf Mountain, and Intrana. The only thing standing in our way was the greatest enemy most of us would ever face in-game, far greater than the new highest level foe of Black Dragons. I am of course talking about the Taverley Gate, a timeless and iconic reminder of how difficult it was not only to pull together $5 every month as a kid, but also how difficult it was to convince an adult to get that money to Jagex. Taverley and its dungeon were complementary map expansions alongside the release of what was then called the Herblaw skill, or Herblore as we know it today, or Herblore as the British would say. This was the second official new skill following the game's initial release. Jagex also threw a bone for those of us stuck on the east side of the Taverley Gate with the release of the Crafting Guild in the Hobgoblin Peninsula, which weren't a lot, but it just felt nice not to be entirely left out with such a massive update, you know? We also saw a further expansion of the game's second region expansion of Karamja. What was once a very tiny island that on its best day played home to a massive clan war, now expanded a little further west with the quiet pirate port of Brimhaven. Somehow those gangs we joined and infiltrated during the Shield of Arav quest also somehow inexplicably set up further outposts here, but nowhere else. The only reason there's a Phoenix Gang base at this isolated little port was because the Black Arm Gang also had a base here. And the only reason the Black Arm Gang set up a base at this isolated little port was because the Phoenix Gang had a base here. Even if one pulled out of town here, the other would just have two bases at this isolated port. It really makes you wonder why we're here. But much like magnets and the tides, you can't explain that. Now, we even saw the release of a brand new region altogether with the Kingdom of Kandarin. Although the capital city remained inaccessible at this time, we did now have access to Catherby, Camelot, and Sears Village, as well as some surrounding areas. Catherby, of course, was a quiet little fishing hamlet located in the morning shadow of White Wolf Mountain. This village served as a major buff to fishing, as you could now catch not only lobsters and swordfish like before, but now bass and sharks as well, all within close proximity of both a proper stationary range and a bank, the only new bank on the world's surface in this entire update. Much better than begging for a fire on the docks of Karamja, paying the ship's fare, and walking all the way to and from a bank in Draenor Village or Falador, like a free-to-play peasant. Of course, the release of Sharks offered a new highest healing food in the game of a whopping 20 hit points. Out in Sears Village, we also saw the addition of an interesting little building here. This was the original party room. This was a unique place where telegrab could not be cast. So if you wanted to host a proper drop party without worrying about cheaters nicking items from across the room, you could safely do so upstairs. Those of you who watched the first episode of the series may remember that the initial release of the Wilderness was the game's relatively largest ever map expansion, doubling the map in size with just a single update. Just when you thought that was gorgeous enough, it was time to flesh out the Wilderness even further. Although it didn't expand in size with this update, some of the empty spaces between notable locations were filled in. We now also had the Dark Warriors Fortress, the East Wilderness Ruins, Red Dragon Isle, now known as Lava Dragon Isle in Old School, and the Bandit Camp, as well as all of the new valuable spawns and features to lure victims away from the safety below the wilderness line. One such feature is the duty-free store in the Bandit Camp. We know this as a place where items can be sold at high alch price, but within the lore of the game's world, the price difference between this store and a normal general store is that the Bandit Camp isn't withholding any taxes on any sale. This would imply the existence of a steep 33% tax withheld when selling to a shop outside the wilderness. That would mean that the Grand Exchange tax first implemented in 2021 was not the game's first tax. Rather, it actually arrived 19 years earlier. Just to demonstrate some quick maths, you could, for example, sell steel plate legs for 600 GP without tax in the wilderness, or for 400 GP outside the wilderness. That means that to sell the same item outside the wilderness, there's an opportunity cost of 33.33%, repeating of course, in the form of a tax paid, presumably to King Rold, to help his wife pay for that fancy garden she ended up just forcing an adventurer to steal for her anyway. Jagex must have modeled old Rolly here after the tyrant King George. It sounds like we may need to begin dumping tea in the waters of Port Sarim to teach him a lesson about overtaxing his citizens.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
I love the young people.
Ask yourself who the real bandits are. Thankfully, Donnie here is not just any lad, but the lad, who charges no such tax. What a fitting name for such a swell lad. Well, we finally finished covering the surface of the map now, so all that leaves is a whole other realm. Merely the game's second other realm after the black hole last year. Continuing with this outer space theme, we actually have to take a trip to the world's moon to visit the lost city of Zanaris. That's right. Canonically, Zanaris is located on RuneScape's moon. However, I have reason to believe this wasn't actually the case in Classic, but more on that later. Once you've made your way to the Lost City, their marketplace was the place to be if you had diamonds burning a hole in your pocket, and if you wanted to get your hands on your first dragon weapon, if you needed a ruby ring to propose to your RuneScape girlfriend, or if you just needed to unload a bunch of cabbages to a guy who always needs to buy more for whatever reason. Now, excluding the Catherby Bank, Zanaris also played home to the only other new bank that came with this massive update. That's right, somehow the Bank of Varrock managed to open a new branch on the moon, years before managing to open one in Lumbridge. No bank in Sears Village, or Port Sarim, or on the whole island of Karamja, or in the entire northern half of the map. But the moon? Oh yeah, that's no problem at all, boss. In fact, they're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, year-round. My bank in the real world only seems to be open during hours while I'm too busy working to visit, and when I do manage to visit, they just keep mentioning their app. How convenient. Anyway, why do I think that Zanaris wasn't always intended to be located on the moon? If you take a look at this map here, and line up the shed in Lumbridge Swamp with the entrance of Zanaris, something peculiar happens with the Marketplace exit. The Marketplace in Old School has a fairy ring that teleports you to Alcarid, but in Classic, it actually has a ladder instead, and it takes you straight up to Alcarid, perfectly lined up with where it should be based on where the shed and the entrance are. This would suggest that it was actually just underground rather than a completely different realm on the moon at the time. That's a wrap on just our first update to the world map of 2002. That's a lot of content for just one update, maybe the most for a single RuneScape update of all time. Access to these changes is what we paid for, and our subscription money is really what saved Jagex and saved RuneScape. But this next update would eventually give rise to someone else taking our money. March 18th, 2002. We received an iconic expansion to the game's first dungeon, the Edgeville Wilderness Dungeon. You know, that place where Framed has gone to PK millions in 29 different videos because noobs think that they're safe here and really don't seem to understand that it's actually a risky part of the wilderness. Even though after the 28th time he claimed it would be his last because players couldn't possibly be bad enough to keep falling for the same tricks, right? Right? Oh, but as both the wilderness and its dungeon should be, with great risk comes great rewards. Buried at the end of both the Edgeville Wilderness Dungeon and the Vast Taverley Dungeon came the 4 elemental obelisks. You could use your brand new glassblowing abilities to make orbs, charge the orbs on these obelisks in the backs of these dangerous dungeons, attach the orbs to a battle staff, and use that battle staff to cast the brand new wave spells with the brand new blood runes. Alternatively, you could alch the battle staff for a good chunk of change. Wow, that's a lot of content packed into a single small update below the surface of the world map. Battle staves were especially useful in RuneScape Classic because your character would default into melee combat automatically even if you first attacked with magic or ranged. So if you cast a combat spell against an enemy without an obstacle in the way, it would drag you into melee combat and you could only cast spells as fast as you could click through the necessary menus, all without interrupting your melee attacks. Also, if a spell failed, you couldn't cast one for another 20 seconds, so you had an incentive to wield the staff for the extra magic bonus rather than just a powerful melee weapon for the melee bonuses. The battle staff in particular, though, added extra melee stats that you needed for this type of combat. It's an odd relic carried forward into RuneScape 2 and Old School where the melee stats of the staff really don't matter since you can just continually cast spells without being forced into hand-to-hand combat and without worrying about failing a spell. Instead of correcting the stats upon the release of RuneScape 2 in March of 2004, they actually didn't fix this until 19 and a half years later in Old School RuneScape by adjusting the magic attack and magic defense stats of battle staves. March 25th, 2002. The United States saw the premiere of the allegedly unscripted reality TV show The Bachelor on this date. A show where a 20 or 30-something-year-old eligible single man breaks the hearts of 24 women by giving each of them a red rose before ultimately finding the one whose heart he will wait to break until a few months later. Now, those might sound like rookie numbers to you RuneScape e-daters out there, but are your fantasy relationships really all that different from their fantasy relationships? Hard for me to say. Maybe the bachelors on the show should have wasted less time caring about who gets a red rose, and instead invested more time caring about a certain blue rose. And you know the guys on that show have terrible taste when they say they want to take things slow, but then send girls like this home. Even my wife agrees with me that the sloth girl here should have won. Rest assured, the guys inevitably end up choosing someone with the personality of a damp rag whom they don't even date long enough to bother introducing to their parents. Really, what's the point? All I know is that e-dating was against the rules of RuneScape for the longest time. However, that didn't stop Paul Gower from breaking his own rules to not only attend, but also to officiate an in-game wedding on Valentine's Day in 2002, less than 2 weeks before that big membership expansion. Maybe Jagex would have gotten the next new skill out in time for that update if they were a little more focused on not breaking their own rules. Instead, we had to wait almost an entire additional month for the Fletching skill that should have dropped back in February. I assume this delay is the reason why the Lost City quest inexplicably has a crafting requirement instead of a Fletching requirement for fletching the Drayman staff needed to enter Zanaris. Remember, J-Mods, RuneScape is not a dating site. Now, until this point, every tree in RuneScape was just a normal tree that would give regular, normal logs when chopped. With this update, the game saw the first oak, willow, maple, yew, and magic trees spread all across the world map. With these new logs you could chop, you could also now fletch them into new types of powerful bows. Other map expansions on this date included the Sorcerers Tower, the Barbarian Outpost, and the Lava Maze Dungeon. What may seem strange to many of you is that the Barbarian Outpost in Classic was not near the waterfall as we know it in Old School today. Rather, it was located near where the Legends Guild is located today. As for the Sorcerers Tower, you could also pay a hefty sum to upgrade your battle staves into mystic staves here. They were actually a melee upgrade, but not some mystical magic upgrade over the new staves from last week, despite what the name might suggest. Again, it wasn't until September of 2021 that they would fix this oversight in Old School RuneScape, even though it should have been adjusted in March of 2004 upon the release of RuneScape 2. The Lava Maze Dungeon in the Deep Wilderness also got released on this date, but didn't really introduce anything new. Just additional options for overcrowded resources and monsters like rune rocks, greater demons, and black demons. If you wanted your own private space to access these highly competitive resources, you had to be willing to risk your gear and loot to do so, but you also had the option to send any unwelcome competition back to Lumbridge. April 9th, 2002. Although the exact date is unknown, this is approximately when the first and second players both reached level 99 firemaking on the same date. Please keep in mind that this achievement is particularly insane because it was only possible to burn normal logs in Classic. So even with the release of Fletching in all of those new trees, those new logs could only be used for Fletching, not firemaking. To be fair, firemaking XP scaled with your level, so it took nearly 75,000 normal logs to reach 99, rather than the 326,000 normal logs that it would take today in Old School. You also had to manually drop each log to light it, so this took a lot more time and effort than it would take today, even without Winter Todd and higher level logs, unless you had someone to drop them for you. With that in mind, you might initially believe that whoever reached level 99 firemaking first would have been like another Blue Rose 13X, who was just so insanely far ahead of everyone else in magic and smithing that it wasn't even a remotely close race to 99. But it was actually a very tight race for level 99 firemaking 23 years ago between two players. Even stranger, it's actually not at all clear who was first and who was second. Was it Dragoon 787 or was it Cow Chicken? Believe it or not, to this very day, these two goblins still argue their respective cases as to who was actually first decades later. No, seriously, they really do. It may have allegedly even escalated to swatting in hostile Twitch stream raids filled with threats, flaming, and trolling. Although the true answer of who was actually first is lost to time, I think I've pieced together the most likely answer through context clues in some very old forum posts. I suspect that Dragoon logged in and reached level 99 and then celebrated for several hours with his friends, all in a single game session that straddled midnight in the UK. However, during the celebrations, but before midnight in the UK, Cow Chicken also reached level 99 firemaking and then immediately logged out. At the time, the high scores would only update once a day, and only upon logging out. So the high scores now showed Cow Chicken as the first and only player to have reached level 99, even though Dragoon was the first player to actually reach 99 in-game. For better or for worse, the damage was done, and the player base saw Cow Chicken reach 99 first on the high scores. And, well, they say history is written by the victors. In any event, let's get back on topic to something a bit more objective. Alongside the release of the Family Crest quest, the only map expansions were the release of the Pillars of Zanash Dungeon, which you may know better today as the Witchaven Dungeon, and a new house in southeast Varrock. That's right, those pillars southeast of Ardougne not only predate the release of the city, but also apparently have a name and some lore behind them, which you can learn if you open up the tourist guidebook found in the city. But then that begs the question, how we knew what to call this dungeon in the 3 short weeks prior to the release of Ardougne. Maybe the Family Crest Dungeon or Hellhound Dungeon, I don't know. In any case, based on this map, the quest makes you travel to the farthest, most extreme southwestern part of the entire world map, whereas today, this just seems like a random place immediately outside Ardougne. April 30th, 2002. Look guys, I don't know how to say this, but Ardougne, Ardougne, Yeah, that last one sounds right. We're going to go with that one. Pronouncing Ardougne without the H is like pronouncing both without the L, or pronouncing espresso without the X. Any other pronunciation should just be criminal, really. Anyway, Ardougne was released alongside the Thieving skill as a complementary map expansion to the new skill, including stalls, chests, and NPCs who could be used to train the new skill. From a lore perspective, Ardougne also serves as the capital city of the Kingdom of Kandarin, and for now, it's just the east side of Ardougne in-game. According to the surprisingly interesting guidebook that we mentioned earlier, Ardougne is known as an exciting, modern city located on the sun-drenched southern coast of Kandarin. Yes, the book still says Ardougne is on the southern coast of Kandarin today, even though that is demonstrably not the case. Once again, another relic from RuneScape Classic that should have been fixed back in 2003 or 2004, but has still persisted into both RuneScape 3 and old school RuneScape today. Now, the book also calls Ardougne the City of Shopping. We all know about the 5-finger discounts offered at the stalls in the main marketplace, but a nice feature at release was actually the unique offerings of its general store. Instead of the usual fare offered by other general stores around the map, this shop specifically sells common vital quest supplies like rope, papyrus, and other various tools regularly required by quests that weren't found in many other convenient places prior to this. The guidebook then goes on to describe Ardougne as the City of Fun. Of course, it lists the pub like every proper city has. However, the city also uniquely contains the only zoo in the game, besides the spooned menagerie at It's Will's house, of course. What's strange is that the book goes on to list a third destination for fun that most players have probably never visited, the Ardougne sewers. According to the book, for the adventurous, there are always rats to be slaughtered in Ardougne's expansive and vermin-ridden sewers. There is truly something for everybody here. Let's move on. Speaking of menacing pests,
he's a menace to the entire city!
May 8th, 2002. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man premiered this week and sat atop the box office. To indulge anyone who felt inspired to become a menace themselves, Jagex expanded the map once again as we return to the far north to see the introduction to the members-only Deep Wilderness. From Ardougne, you could pull a cursed lever to teleport all the way to the infamous Deserted Keep, where you might encounter such fearsome foes as Polevser. If you were lucky enough to survive an encounter with him or other similar cryptids, you too could travel east to AFK train at the Axe Hut. Past that, the historically useless Scorpion Pit that plays home to Scorpia in Old School today, and in the farthest northeast corner of the entire map lies the Rogue's House, or Rogue's Castle as we know it today. To the west of the Deserted Keep lies the Pirates' Hideout, and strangely, exactly half of a Redberry pie inside. Rumor has it that these pirates once had acquired a full Redberry pie from some poor adventurer passing through their encampment within the Asgarnia Ice Dungeon, who was just trying to help some squire or other, but some kind of nearby apex predator caught a whiff of it and actually managed to eat half of the pie before the pirates noticed. Fortunately, Jagex didn't allow even Thurgo to eat both halves of a pie in the same tick before he had to retreat. To keep the remaining half safe, the pirates decided that some of their crew would remain, but the rest would circumnavigate the continent to get as far away from the hunter as they could and set up camp in this hideout in the wilderness, where they locked the doors behind them. The beast would have to navigate all the way north and survive through the wilderness just to find out it needs a lockpick, walk all the way back, smith its own lockpick, and make its way back again. It was a perfect plan, as it would give them plenty of time to escape. Although their ship was severely damaged upon landing, they knew it would be safer to take their chances hiding amongst the fire giants and shadow spiders in the deep wilderness dungeon to their immediate south than to stand between Thurgo and half a Redberry pie. As a last resort, they could always make their way to the west, to the new northern expansion of the Frozen Waste Plateau. That's the story of how the exact same pirates from the Asgarnia Ice Dungeon ended up in level 50 wilderness with a crashed ship and half a Redberry pie. There was also one other addition to the wilderness just south of here, the Deep Wilderness Chaos Temple. You know, that one place where Iron Men on Old School go to get PK'd by YouTubers who just reset their banks to zero, maybe allowing for a single trendy item. You know, you'd think that concept would get old after a while, but alas. What also gets old is when the players who brought their entire stack of noted bones into the wilderness go to Reddit to whine about getting PK'd in the wilderness, as if it would be balanced game design to have an effective 7 times XP multiplier per bone be risk-free. If you want a risk-free XP multiplier, you better get a head start on gathering those buckets of slime, because the Ectofuntus is your only risk-free option. And before you start running to the comments to enlighten me that player-owned houses and gilded altars exist, let's just say that we all know someone who would beg to differ about that option being risk-free. Outside the wilderness, we did get a couple of small changes to the world map with Chuck's Workshop and the Makeover Mage Hut. Chuck's Place was where you could go to exchange logs and stackable certificates, much like Miles, Niles, and Giles for fish, ores, and bars in Draenor Village Market. Notably, the North Ardougne bank that you would expect to be next door would not exist for several more months. The Makeover Mage Hut is the place where players could go to change their appearance. Not only did this mean that the palest guy in your future Discord could pretend to have the darkest skin tan available, but now players who overzealously click through character creation, like my brother, wouldn't have to all look identical to one another with the default appearance. And speaking of clones and bots, May 28th, 2002, Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, also premiered just a couple of weeks beforehand. If you, like Anakin Skywalker, are also not fond of sand, women, and children, then don't worry, because this update doesn't add any more of them to break the immersion of your favorite retro medieval clicking simulator, or whatever it is you guys are saying these days. With only one tiny exception on the other side of White Wolf Mountain, all of our updates on this date take place within the new Kingdom of Kandarin. Sears Village finally got its own bank. No longer would you have to go from the flax field to the spinning wheel to Catherby Bank to make and bank those bowstrings. No longer would you have to chop an inventory of maple logs and walk all the way to Catherby to bank, since now there was a bank right next to the maple trees in Sears Village. Just to the west, we also got another little fishing hamlet called Hemenster, as well as the mostly useless McGrubor's Wood. It's a pretty underwhelming area for taking up such a large amount of space, and really is a mostly useless area after the fishing contest, with a couple of niche exceptions in the future. The main reward of the quest, of course, was to bypass White Wolf Mountain, with a safe, underground shortcut to reach Kandarin from Asgarnia, or vice versa. This may not seem like a big deal today, since you can just take the long way around to avoid the wolves in Old School, but in Classic, there was no safe long way around, so you had to face the wolves head-on to make it across the mountain. And don't forget that in Classic, you would have to face an enemy for at least 3 rounds of combat before you could possibly escape or eat. So this was a pretty dangerous trek for the average low-leveled player. Most players also didn't have the magic level required to teleport to Camelot anyway. So this tunnel was a lifesaver for the average player. Literally. Further south in Kandarin, we also saw an expansion to the south of Artie with the release of the Monastery and surrounding area alongside the Monk's Friend quest. The Monastery was originally shaped in an interesting way. It reminds me of the coldest days of winter for some reason. Anyway, what a year for the southern side of the world. Speaking of which, June 17th, 2002. Brazil was on the verge of winning its second in just 3 World Cups, this time over Germany in Japan. This absolute legend scored both of the goals in the final to lead Brazil to glory. Germany would go on to get some payback against Brazil in Brazil 12 years later on Germany's way to winning its first ever World Cup, not to be confused with West Germany's big win in 1990. This revenge was many years in the making. Speaking of plotting revenge for many years, we also saw the release of the Temple of Ikov quest on this date, where we either helped Lucian steal the Staff of Armadil, or not, on his own quest for revenge. This, of course, introduced the mostly useless Temple of Ikov dungeon that really doesn't serve any useful function after the quest until the release of RuneScape 2, since the Boots of Lightness found inside the dungeon would go on to lower your weight by 4 kilograms. Not applicable in Classic, though. This update also served as an expansion and a sequel of sorts to the last update. The area south of Ardougne also added the Clocktower alongside the similarly named quest. Now, if you just move the Clocktower in front of the Monastery, then it would feel a little bit more like summer. Hemenster also saw a major expansion with the release of the Fishing Guild. It has a pretty rough entry requirement compared to other guilds, but it was a nice area that allowed players to catch any type of fish close to a bank, even closer than in Catherby. Even McGrubor's Wood got an expansion of sorts. The locked building now had a key that allowed players to bypass the Temple of Ikov dungeon all the way to the very back. The only useful feature in the back was some additional lesser demon spawns that helped to reduce overcrowding at other spawns in Classic. Other than this, McGrubor's Wood really only served the purpose of being an unnecessary obstacle that arbitrarily gave great utility to the next update just by being in the way. July 23rd, 2002. We all had that highly functional friend of a friend in our 20s with the goofy nickname and the natural talent for amateur mixology, who put his talents to good use at your favorite house parties. For Paul and Andrew Gower, the original founders of Jagex and RuneScape, that real-life mate was known as none other than Stankers. The absolute legend himself and his infamous poison chalices were forever immortalized into RuneScape. Much like his poison chalices from the real world, the ones in-game were also hit or miss and could have any variety of effects. Notably, the only way to boost your creativity enough for a +1 boost to your crafting level at the time. These extracurricular hobbies make you wonder what these guys like the real Stankers went on to do for a living. If they didn't open a pub named after their nickname, chances are good that they became a successful businessman, got elected to some high-ranking political office, or took on some other kind of significant leadership role. In-game, however, he was none other than the supervisor for one of the most important quality-of-life content updates in all of Classic. Look, I really can't overstate the importance of mining coal in Classic. We didn't have these bosses like Zulrah in Old School that just spit out resources like 200 noted coal every 15 drops. We either had to get them the old-fashioned way, or we had to buy them from someone else who got them the old-fashioned way. Coal rocks were generally far from banks, they were a highly contested resource, and there was no such thing as a coal bag back then. So what seems like a useless feature today was actually revolutionary in 2002. I am, of course, talking about the coal trucks. Minecarts located next to the largest concentration of coal rocks in the game that could store several inventories worth of coal at a time. And then those minecarts carried your coal for you to another location near the Sears Village Bank that allowed you to empty the minecarts much easier. This really saved a lot of time. Instead of having to bank after every inventory, which would have been a very long walk all the way around the Fishing Guild, since neither the agility skill nor the Eastern Log shortcut existed yet. You could stay and wait to bank after mining, storing 4 inventories worth in the carts, plus a 5th inventory in your own bag. All this coal was crucial to players being able to train their smithing skill, and crucial for smithing the type of low-level, free-to-play gear that may not impress us by today's standards, but still played a very important role in the game's ecosystem in 2002. And as we've seen with many of the other popular mines as well, Jagex also added aggressive enemies amongst the rocks to deter level 3 mining bots. We also saw the release of 3 new quests that all added more real estate to the game: Holy Grail, Fight Arena, and Tree Gnome Village. Holy Grail, of course, added the Fisher King realm, but it also added the jungle west of Brimhaven, including the Horseshoe of Gold Rocks, which were also a competitive resource at the time. To prevent level 3 bots from mining the gold here, once again, Jagex made sure to include these poisonous scorpions here to help limit their access to only legitimate players. The use of specifically poisonous scorpions in particular is notable because they were spawned in such a way that they were pretty much impossible to avoid, and if a bot got poisoned, it would eventually die even a while after leaving combat, but notably before being able to bank. Also, one interesting note about the Fisher King realm is that the Black Knight Titan from the quest remains the last graphical relic of RuneScape 2 within RuneScape 3. They forgot to update him during the many graphical reworks and then just decided to keep him that way as a running joke. Although there is a way to opt into an updated graphical model for the character if you really want to. This is the one and only game model that is identical between Old School and RuneScape 3 today. The other two quests, Fight Arena and Tree Gnome Village, also further expanded this area south of Ardougne, like the previous two world map expansions in May and June. This time, we got the Battlefield of Khazard, the Tree Gnome Village, and the Fight Arena, and Port Khazard. All of these new areas revolve around General Khazard, who would go on to play a big role in some endgame quests in the distant future. It really gets you wondering if they had these storylines planned out so many years in advance, or if they retcon some future storylines around some old throwaway characters. I suspect the answer is actually a little bit of both based on the RS3 timeline, but what do I know? Someone should ask Modad. The main significance of these updates to the world map would have to be the game's first transportation system besides teleport spells and ships. That's right, this date also saw the release of Spirit Trees. Players who managed to beat the Khazard Warlord were rewarded with access to this transportation network that could take you to or from the Tree Gnome Village. The only two other Spirit Tree locations upon release were at the Battlefield of Khazard, essentially just allowing players to bypass the maze, in this seemingly random location here, northwest of Varrock and east of Edgeville, just south of the wilderness. This location was pretty inconvenient since before the Grand Exchange there were no shortcuts in or out of the city, but at least we now had easy transportation from the far east side of the map to the far west side of the map. With just these three locations to choose from, the Fairy's Flight Relic might have been one of the most useless of all time if we had leagues at the time in Classic. August 15th, 2002. We saw the release of the Hazeel cult quest, which opened up the sewers south of Ardougne, as well as the Carnillean mansion and the incinerator from the beloved Sheepherder quest. Hazeel cult was another one of those quests that wouldn't really have an impact on any future quest for a long time. However, the proximity to the release of the Khazard quest makes me think that they really did have an elaborate plan all along, even if the specifics didn't get ironed out until the distant future. In any case, the Mazharat storyline, even over 22 years, turned out to be more cohesive and planned out than the entire Star Wars sequel trilogy. Yes, these 20-something-year-old socially awkward computer nerds from the UK managed to write a better, more interesting story than alleged professional Hollywood writers. I want to say that's impressive, but by comparison, it probably wasn't that difficult to do a better job in this case. What's interesting here is that if we look at an underground map of the sewers lined up with the surface of the map, we can see that the sewers perfectly bifurcate East Ardougne from the then future update of West Ardougne. This would imply that the two sides of the city share a sewer system, which is pretty suspicious seeing as their tour guidebook advertises the sewers as a fun place to visit, especially because there would inevitably be plague-ridden sewage and rats down there. I don't know, seems really suspicious, but those sheep that appeared north of the city sure are all sorts of unnatural bright colors, almost as if their wool had been dyed. If only we had some sort of plumber with a pressure washer of sorts to verify all of these new problems. August 27th, 2002. North America had just seen the release of Super Mario Sunshine, a shiny, bright, and colorful new installment of this iconic series, which was a general trend we would see in many other games for the Nintendo GameCube. However, the game wouldn't release in Europe until the following May, so Jagex must have missed the memo on that gaming trend since just one day later, Jagex would release a dark, gloomy, rat-infested, plague-filled, hopeless quarantine zone. That's right, we saw not only the release of the Plague City quest and West Ardougne, but this update also started one of the wildest, genre-bending quest lines of all time. At first, it seems like at face value that it really is a plague-infested city where you have to rescue Elena. After all, there are even plague-infected sheep nearby who need to be incinerated, so we know it's real. Right? Elena soon discovers that the so-called plague is a hoax being used to cover up the discovery of elves in the far west. To get there, you need to traverse a deadly underground dungeon below the Galapagos Mountains, where a fragment of a dead elf god pretends to be the son of the usurper Zamorak and drives the players to madness, even making them spill the blood of an innocent unicorn. Geez, this lady sounds like a total psycho. No wonder they had to lock her up multiple times for her own safety. After all that, you accidentally help evil elves by killing the king's brother at the king's command. More like fratricide than regicide at that point, but okay. Then you dye some sheep, various colors, to further perpetuate the plague hoax. Then you help the good elves seal the Death Altar as the ultimate source of power, as if the Blood Rune Altar and Wrath Rune Altars don't exist as well. Then you discover the king is evil, and that he faked the plague specifically for his own power. Elena was going around telling the truth about the plague, so King Lathis and the mourners imprisoned her. So naturally, you had to cosplay as one of the king's professional pickpocket victims to stage several false flags to garner enough support against the king, lead an uprising against him, have him executed, unite various ancient clans of elves, defeat the fragment of a god, and regrow the crystal city of Prifddinas, where they lived happily ever after. Wait, this all started with helping a dad find his missing daughter who was just trying to provide some humanitarian aid to the sick? Just wild stuff. This questline kinda reminds me of Sam Raimi's original Evil Dead trilogy, starting as the classic, archetypal cabin-in-the-woods horror movie, and eventually somehow morphing into some fantasy epic 2 movies later during Army of Darkness. How do they even come up with this stuff? Once the dust had settled with the fragment of Saren shattered and the crystal city of Prifddinas restored, rumor has it that Elena wanted to keep chasing that high of her plague hoax being proven right all along, when everyone else doubted her, except for us, who knew better. She followed up on whispers and rumors of other suspicious conspiracies to the ends of the world, trying to recreate the magic, sometimes even making accusations about other world leaders as well, but was never quite able to find that next smoking gun like she did with the inert plague sample we gathered for her during the Biohazard quest. Funding all of this travel was expensive, so she resorted to hawking dangerous dietary supplements that deplete one's vitality and resilience to her gullible followers, who believed all of her insane ramblings just to cover her costs, no matter the consequences. How sad. Anyway, finally back to the world map. The northern side of East Ardougne also got a little love on this day too, when they finally added the North Bank to East Ardougne as well. That's right, it took nearly 4 months after the release of Chuck, a Surtur NPC for Logs, who lived in this building, to get a nearby bank. Without Chuck being here, we may never have gotten a bank here. To thank him for his permanent, lasting contributions, Jagex removed him from RuneScape 2, but left his vacant house standing. I personally think they should bring him back, even if he's just retired and it serves no other utility besides some inevitable new clue step in 2027 or something. September 9th, 2002. This date saw the release of the Sea Slug quest and also the small map expansion of the fishing platform. Another one of those relics of the past that really serves no function in the future and could have just as easily been a quest-only instanced area rather than an actual location on the surface of the world map. The fishing platform canonically is probably one of the worst places to fish in the game because the platform has been overrun by mind-controlling sea slugs, which we can only assume are a tribute to or rip-off of either the headcrab zombies from the Half-Life series, the Flood from the Halo series, or maybe even both. Or, let's be honest, it's most likely reference to some obscure sci-fi story from the 1980s that no one has ever heard of except for inevitably that one guy in the comments who, no doubt, will be sure to let us all know. Anyway, the fishing platform wouldn't be the last map update of September. By the end of the month, we would see Jagex go on to release both the beginning and the end of RuneScape Classic, all on the very same day. If you want to learn about that and more in the next episode, be sure to subscribe.